Small businesses are often called the backbone of America's economy, and it's easy to see why. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 99.7% of all U.S. companies employ 500 people or less. Between 1993 and 2011, small businesses accounted for 64% of all newly created jobs. In fact, they're considered so important that laws are in place to ensure that these firms have fair access to government contracts. By law, the government must provide at least 23% of all federal contracts to small businesses. But my next guest claims that the Small Business Administration, which is responsible for handing out these contracts, is breaking the law. Lloyd is the president and founder of the Small Business League. He joins me now to discuss these revelations. Thanks so much for coming on, Lloyd. Let's start by talking about this yet-to-be-released legal opinion from Professor Charles Tiefer, one of the foremost experts on federal contracting law. He claims that over the last decade, small businesses have been cheated out of as much as $1 trillion. Can you briefly outline how this has happened and what kind of documentary evidence he has to make this claim?
All right. Well, Professor Tiefer is one of the nation's leading experts on federal contracting law. He was a commissioner on the Commission on Wartime Spending in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he's done extensive research, and his research really complies with what I've done and a lot of other people, which shows that the federal acquisition budget is actually $1.1 trillion. That's significant because federal law says that small businesses are supposed to get 23% of all government contracts, which would be around $253 billion a year. Well, the government is using a number that's less than half of the real acquisition budget, which is about 480. And they're claiming that last year small businesses got $89 billion, and most of that went to Fortune 500 firms. So that's around 198, maybe 200 billion a year. It's gone on for a decade. So you're talking about in the last 10 years, American small businesses have been cheated out of about $2 trillion. And that's just unbelievable. And it's, again, this is Professor Tiefer, one of the nation's leading experts, and he says it's fraud. And I agree with him completely.
So you're saying it's intentional fraud. I mean, how many contracts are we talking about here going off to Fortune 500 companies instead of small businesses?
You're talking thousands of contracts. Last year, 235 Fortune 500 firms got federal small business contracts. And I'm afraid what's happening is, I'm afraid President Obama is going to close the Small Business Administration within the next 30 days to try to cover up the abuses. His rationale for trying to close the SBA is to save $300 million a year. Well, that's ridiculous. At the same time, he's going to propose to close the SBA to save $300 million. He's going to spend $7 billion to build power plants in Africa, and literally trillions of dollars are unaccounted for at the Pentagon and the Federal Reserve. So it's ludicrous to close the only agency in America to help the 28 million small businesses that create over 90% of the net new jobs for $300 million. So when you look at Professor Tiefer's opinion, when you look at the investigations from the SBA's own Inspector General that Obama appointed, and all the other investigations that have been done by federal agencies and by the media, clearly there's rampant fraud and abuse at the SBA. Small businesses have been cheated out of over, I'll say right around $1 trillion, and I think President Obama is going to close the SBA to try to cover it up.
Well, as you just mentioned, he's yet appointed a replacement for Karen Mills, who resigned over 10 months ago. I mean, it's really amazing how reluctant they are to replace this really important position. Let's talk about what they're alleging is happening here. They're saying it's because of anomalies and human error that all these contracts are going to Fortune 500 companies. You allege that that's not the case. You're saying this is deliberate. What's the motive? What's the reason to give these contracts to giant corporations?
Well, you know, basically, I think the government's corrupt. I think what's happening at the SBA is systematic, what's happening at every agency. But it's about greed. These large corporations want that money. We're talking about, you know, $250 billion a year. They want the money. So they've lobbied Congress and worked with federal agencies to get policies, you know, to divert the money to them. And but it is kind of interesting that since Karen Mills resigned, by the way, he's appointed 270 people to fill vacant positions, but he hasn't filled anybody to take over the SBA. Again, I think that's very clear evidence that he's trying to close the SBA to cover up these rampant abuses.
Has he given a statement as why he hasn't fulfilled that position?
No, and that's interesting. Not only has he not just explained it, but it's been uncovered by the major media. You won't see any stories in the mainstream media talking about the fact that he's appointed 270 people, but not anyone to head the SBA. You won't see anyone in the mainstream media mentioning that he's cheated small businesses out of over $1 trillion since he took office. These excuses about anomalies, it's really kind of comical. An anomaly would be a random occurrence, right?
Right.
Like getting hit by lightning or flipping a coin. And on a federal contract, you're either small or large. So if people were making random mistakes, half the time they would report an award to a small business as being a large business contract, and half the time they would report an award to a small business as being a large business contract. It would cancel itself out, right? We don't see that. Every year for a decade, we see billions and billions of dollars being reported as going to large corporations. So this excuse of anomalies and miscoding and computer glitches, it's absurd. And I think what really perturbs me is this has been going on for a decade. Right. And in 10 years, not one reporter in America has ever asked anybody in the government to explain why these supposed random anomalies always diverts federal small business contracts from small business and given to big business. It's not once ever.
Well,
that's the first thing I would ask.
Let's talk about that, because why? I mean, we live in a corporatocracy that's not really surprising that these contracts are being doled out to giant corporations, but why the media? I mean, beyond just corporate media, even independent media, why has there been no follow-up to this story, Lloyd? And you claim that you've been censored trying to tell the story. What evidence do you have to back up that claim?
Well, I'm afraid, I think everybody knows that the media in America is predominantly liberal, and I found that
predominantly liberal. Come on, Lloyd. It's run by giant corporations who have profit-making motives.
Yeah. Well, let's just say this: when you see a liberal media outlet, they just won't do stories that are not flattering to President Obama. And you know, to tell you the truth, I'll have to say I'm puzzled, really, why this is happening, but you just don't see it happening. If you go on YouTube, I've got a YouTube channel, Lloyd Chapman on YouTube, and look at the stories, you don't see a single story that questions this anomaly excuse. You don't see a single story that talks about the fact that small businesses have been cheated out of $1 trillion, and you don't see them mention the word fraud. So we've seen the SB Inspector General mention fraud. We've seen a number of federal investigations mention fraud. Professor Teaver, whose opinion is irrefutable, he's widely accepted.
And I'm so sorry to cut you off. We're out of time. We'll look out for that legal brief, and we'll definitely follow up. Thank you so much for coming on, breaking down this really complicated issue. Lloyd Chapman, President, Founder, American Small Business League. Really appreciate your time.